Temos a honra de receber aqui na cidade de Fortaleza o professor Túlio Scovassi, da Universidade de Milão, uma das maiores autoridades mundiais em repatriação de bens culturais, professor de Direito Administrativo, Direito Constitucional, e com ele vamos conversar sobre os temas de suas mais recentes pesquisas e especificamente sobre a questão da repatriação de bens culturais, uma questão válida para todo o mundo, inclusive com problemas específicos aqui no estado do Ceará. Vamos, inclusive, fazer questionamentos a respeito de como essa questão da repatriação dos bens culturais se comunica com o patrimônio cultural imaterial, uma problemática muito forte aqui no Brasil.
Let me start by saying how pleased I am to be here in Fortaleza to participate in this meeting on cultural rights, and I thank very much my friend Professor Umberto for the invitation. I have made research on different aspects, for example, underwater cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage. In the last years, I have devoted myself to the question of restitution of removed cultural properties. That's a question of great interest for my country, Italy. About cultural rights, many scholars have spent days, weeks, months, years trying to find the definition of cultural rights. I would not enter into a definition from the legal point of view. I would say that there are some treaties about cultural rights, and they try to protect cultural rights in certain situations: time of peace, time of war, tangible heritage, intangible heritage, underwater cultural heritage, restitution of removed cultural properties. So in legal terms, there are different aspects of cultural rights, and all of them emphasize a need to protect cultural rights rather than a single definition of cultural rights. In Italy, we have a tradition of legislation for the protection of cultural rights, and the first enactments date back to the 17th century. In the state of Florence, it was a prohibition of exports of certain cultural properties, paintings by famous masters. So we have a tradition which focuses on the public interest in the protection of cultural rights. For example, the right of the state of preemption in the case of sales of cultural properties, the right of the state to authorize the export of cultural properties. And so we are still on this line that cultural properties are different from any other kind of properties. There is a special interest of the state in protecting cultural properties. It's not a good which is on the common market, but there is an interest for the protection of cultural properties. And still, this aspect is present in our recent legislation, in the Code of Cultural Properties, which has been adopted in 2004. I think that also in South America there is an interest of the state in protecting cultural properties. For example, certain South or Central American countries such as Peru or Mexico, they have an interest in fighting against the illegal removal of cultural properties, for example, clandestine excavations. And so that's a common aspect between states around the Mediterranean, such as Italy, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and certain Latin American states. Of course, in Italy, we have monuments which are visited by thousands of tourists. For example, the Colosseum in Rome or Pompeii, close to Naples. And there are problems given by the high pressure of tourism over the protection of cultural properties. But in my view, this can be regulated. It's not the major problem. The major problem that we have in Italy still is given by clandestine excavations of cultural properties and also thefts in museums and churches because of lack of sufficient protection. I would say that the main problem that we have in Italy still is illegal removal of cultural properties. In several cases, the organized criminality is involved in certain areas in Italy in making excavations, and then they have connections with traders who live in other countries, and then at the end of the link, the cultural property appears in a museum in foreign countries. And Italy has concluded agreements with some American museums in order to have the properties illegally excavated given back to Italy and to establish cooperation. For example, in exchange for the restitution of the cultural property, Italy gives loans of cultural properties of equivalent value that can be exhibited in a museum. It goes also to the benefit of the country to have exceptional cultural items exhibited in foreign museums because it attracts tourists. Then the other problem that we have in Italy is a better organization of tourism, because in certain cases tourism is not affected only by tourist pressure, but also by unexpected strikes in public services related to tourism, and tourists have to wait for hours before having the opening of the excavation of the museum. So we need a better organization of the tourism sector as a whole to attract more tourists. But I would say that Italy has a great cultural heritage, and so it is a duty for the country to preserve the cultural heritage and make future generations benefit from it. We have two international conventions which are applicable to the illegal trafficking of cultural properties. One is the 1970 Convention, which was adopted within the framework of UNESCO, and the other is a convention that was adopted in 1995 within the framework of another international organization, UNIDROIT. And both conventions are complementary. They can go together, but the problem is that the second convention, which is more effective than the first one, has been ratified by a limited number of countries, I would say about 35 or 36. And the first convention has been ratified by more states, 126, but it is less effective it is weaker. It has some weak points that can be exploited to engage in illicit trafficking of cultural properties. For example, the 1970 Convention does not apply to illegal excavations. It needs that cultural properties are documented in a museum, and you can understand that properties which are illegally excavated are not documented anywhere. So there are still many problems to be addressed at the international level as regards the trafficking of cultural properties. Here we have a problem. Many cultural properties have been removed in the past centuries, in the last years, and it is evident that not all of them shall be returned. But it is also evident that not all of them shall be retained. So the problem is how to define a threshold for having the return of cultural properties. In what case should cultural properties which have been removed be returned to the state of origin? And there could be some relevant circumstances in order to take a decision. For example, the substantive injustice of the removal, if the removal has been made taking advantage from the weakness of the country of origin. For example, cases of colonial domination or foreign occupation. Then another important element is the integrity of cultural context. Cultural context should be preserved in their original situation as much as possible. Today you have half of the Parthenon marbles in Greece and half of the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum in London. The cultural context has lost its integrity. Then another important element is the emblematic character of certain cultural properties. There are some archaeological objects which are repetitive, and there is no need to have them returned, at least all of them. But there are some cultural objects that are unique for a certain country. They are the symbol of the country. For example, the Parthenon marbles are the symbol not only of Greek civilization, but I would say the whole Western civilization. And so it's different. And then another important element is the care that the state of origin would give to the cultural properties if they were given back to him. Then another important element is the time that has passed since the removal of the cultural property, and also the care that the state of destination has given to the preservation of the cultural property. So you have to balance all these factors and then to take a decision on whether the property should be given back or not. I would say that the situation is different. Intangible heritage is not an object, it's a tradition. It's very much linked to people. You cannot preserve an object without preserving the tradition, without preserving the people who engage in the practice which constitutes intangible cultural heritage. So here, in most cases, we do not have a problem of repatriation, but we have the problem of preserving the tradition and to make interventions for the benefit of the practitioners of the tradition wherever they are located. So the objects in the case of intangible cultural heritage are only a part of a broader cultural concept which is not limited to a single object. Of course, Brazil is particularly rich in intangible cultural heritage and is very active within the framework of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Intangible Cultural Heritage. No, I think that Brazil is a great country. It has also a great cultural heritage, also coming from the colonial period, and a great intangible cultural heritage. So Brazil should cooperate at the international level in order to best protect its cultural heritage, not to be involved in illegal movements of cultural properties. So I wouldn't say that there is any special problem that affects in particular Brazil in a different way as other countries. A special question of interest for Brazil could be the protection of the intangible heritage of indigenous population. The problem does not affect only Brazil, but many also countries in the world, for example, India or other countries, especially countries in development. And the problem is that indigenous population have developed traditional healing properties and medicines, and which are based on the traditional knowledge of nature. And then there is a foreign corporation that patents the same medicine and puts it on the market and gets profit from the market. So how can we protect the rights of the indigenous population? So far, at the international level, there is an international organization on intellectual property rights, WIPO, and it is developing a regime for the recognition of intellectual property rights of indigenous population. But so far, the work has not been completed yet. And then another means could be to have a strong domestic legislation against what is called biopiracy. That's the illegal appropriation of intellectual knowledge of indigenous population. So I understand that this is quite an important problem for many countries, and regrettably, it has not yet been addressed in a sufficient way at the international level. That's a tragic situation, because as it has been stressed in the Security Council resolution that has been adopted in February this year, is Resolution 2199. On the one side, we have the destruction of cultural property for ideological reasons. And on the other side, we have the illegal trade of cultural properties to finance terrorism. So that's a very difficult and serious situation that for the first time combines the two aspects, destruction and illegal trade. And it is very difficult to do something because any kind of intervention is very dangerous in the present situation that we have in Iraq and Syria. Also, if we envisage some blue helmets for the protection of cultural heritage, there is an Italian proposal to have a special force composed not only of military staff but also of civil staff to ensure the protection of cultural heritage. You need a certain situation of security to make an intervention. So for the time being, it's very difficult to envisage some effective intervention to deal with the situation. But the question is being discussed, both at the United Nations and at UNESCO. But I would add two other comments. First, that terrorists, they do not sell cultural properties to other terrorists. They sell cultural properties to traders, to collectioners, to museums that are located somewhere in Europe or in America. So it is possible to intervene on those who help terrorists and to make legislation which establish also criminal sanctions for all those who buy illegally removed cultural properties. And then another remark is that the very difficult case of cultural properties removed from Iraq and Syria, which is a very special case that is made to finance terrorism, does not should not avoid a broader consideration of the problem. Not only we have this very special trafficking, but we have a general problem of illegal trafficking in many countries in the world that is not made to finance terrorism, but is made only for the benefit of the pockets of the private individuals who are engaged in the traffic. So the fight against terrorism should not prevent a broader fight against any kind of illegal trafficking of cultural properties.